All right, welcome back. I'm glad all of you are still with us. So our next speaker today took on agriculture as a second career after working several years as an engineer. Barry Hill is a prominent figure in the Six Nations community, and I could try to give you a list of all the agricultural development, community, and improvement organizations he's been a part of or even presided over, but I think it will be more effective to hear about his experiences in his own words. Today, Barry joins us to speak about the role of Indigenous peoples in the history of agriculture in Canada and discuss some of the current unique challenges faced by First Nations community as well as their successes. Please welcome Barry.
And this is alrighty. Thank you. Good morning. Sago. I was really pleased and privileged to be asked to speak today. This has kind of gone full circle for me in my life because my very first speech that I ever did was on the back of a trailer as a dancer in an Indian troupe of dancers, and they said, well, your mother's a school teacher, you make the speech. And I confessed last night that I also took a course, well, I took several courses from the OAC by correspondence, back when stamps were cheap. Most of the guys that marked my papers are now retired, I think. And so at this point, I should be home harvesting corn, but I thought it was important that we share some information today in this time of reconciliation that is being talked about a lot. None of that really makes any sense unless we understand each other and what it is you're reconciling with, right? And so I'm going to paint a picture going back over several years, starting several years ago in pre-contact, and work up to modern times and talk about some of the challenges and successes that have occurred along the way. I read a book, I was actually looking at a book last night, and I'd never heard this before, and I'm not sure what to make of it. It was talking about a certain individual who had done a lot of research on ethnology and anthropology, and he was a success on both sides of the buckskin curtain. Wow, what an image that is, right? So nevertheless, I'd like to share with you some background of agriculture from an Indigenous perspective. I'm used to talking and delivering papers on computer engineering or agricultural topics closer to production. But in introducing myself, in the context, only in the context that I'm speaking today, just to point out that I'm from the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm a Mohawk, member of the Guelph clan, and I'm also a church organist. So I'm a Gemini, so that explains a lot. That explains a lot too. That explains a lot too. So just to set a context to begin with, of the total area of Canada, less than 1%. I've seen numbers between 0.2 and 0.8. Less than 1% of the total area of Canada is reserved for Native people. That's the area of all the areas designated under the Indian Act for our people to reside in. There are 630 different individual territories in that allotment, some with more than one nation present. This was part of my discussion last fall when I was talking about food sovereignty from an indigenous perspective, and how do you achieve that when those 630 individual territories are spread across Canada on anything from rock to muskeg, or in my case, Haldeman clay. So on Six Nations of the Grand, which is where I live, we have about 12,000 residents full-time, 25,000 people registered. It's currently measures 46,000 acres, of which half is bush, mostly logged out, but still covered in trees. The next 25% is covered in housing. So we got about 12,000 acres available for agriculture. Of that, there's pasture and some field crops. And it's shrinking fast. So somewhat along the line, it's what I'm going to say is somewhat of a cautionary tale for the rest of you, because in about land use and the best use of land, we don't have, it is not popular to have zoning in our territory. So there's no land use designation. And so some of the land I'm currently cropping is already designated for housing, which has had higher priority than agriculture. So and I remember the days when I've been involved with my family for a long time in agriculture. We had friends that worked on a farm. That was a kind of a tradition in my parents' era where people went and worked on farms in different parts of Ontario. So these people were farming Robinson Farms, I remember that, at the corner of the QEW and the 403, going to Niagara Falls. It's what I call African violet soil. The most beautiful soil you ever saw. It's now under Mapleview Mall. And that whole area along the QEW between the QEW and Lakeshore from Toronto all the way down to the Golden Horseshoe area is like that, and we've paved it over. So I hope we don't do the same. Now, where do we begin? Well, I left home, and the story begins first of all, let me just back up a minute. Because of this vast country, the areas I've described, you're obviously going to have cultural differences between the East Coast, the West Coast, the Middle, and Southeastern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario. And I'll show that in my particular area. We were settling in 1785. That's 100 years before the settlement in the West. People were still nomadic with the buffalo. In some areas, we had Custer's Last Stand, all this kind of stuff. In the late 1800s, BC had a different culture. They were more closely aligned with the sea and so on. And then the north was completely different, and the Inuit and so on were a completely different culture too. So all I think I'm qualified to say at all about is where I come from, which is the Haudenosaunee. If I flip back over the next half hour and call myself an Indian on the reserve, that's how I was brought up. Later on, we became Aboriginal. And then later, now we're told we're Indigenous. But we know that we're Ungahoi. That's what we call people. And the Haudenosaunee is, that's Cayuga in Mohawk language, is Haudenosaunee. Means people of the longhouse. Not only because we lived in those structures, but it's a metaphorical for the extended family. The house gets bigger as the family gets bigger. When the Prince of Wales came in 1907 and was adopted into the tribe, the expression was another rafter was added to the longhouse, right? And he was included. So our culture is filled with it's not a written language, but it's filled with imagery and very beautiful in many ways. So beginning in the time of contact, you'll see our Six Nations inherited a territory between Buffalo and the eastern seaboard, primarily near the Hudson River, coming up from New York. We were down in Manhattan. So the different nations that constitute this confederacy were aligned in vertical strips, as it were, and there's lakes still named after them. The Mohawks are on the east side, the eastern door, and the Senecas on the western door. And they had their culture there. It's a religious, political, cultural system that's all wound together, built around a belief of in a great spirit. During the course of the year, the traditional peoples follow a pattern that celebrates the seasons and the growth and the death of plants, the harvest, and so forth. At the beginning of every important meeting, or the Longhouse Festival, as they're called, when the people go and celebrate the particular ceremony, we recite a Thanksgiving prayer, and it gives thanks for all the aspects of creation, starting with the earth, and it's interesting because your eyes go up. And so you start with the plants, and then the trees, and then the birds, and the sky, and all this type of thing. And we employ it even in the church services that I put together. So this governed how our society ran, starting with the maple syrup in the spring, then the blessing of the seeds and planting, and this strawberry was always celebrated as the first fruit of the year. It's the drink used during all the festivals, and then corn harvest and so forth. This is a stained glass window in the Mohawk Chapel in Brantford, where I'm the chair of the committee, and it's meant to show Diganuida, known as our peacemaker, which united those 5 nations confederacy. Prior to that, like most neighbors, we didn't always get along. Similar in culture and agriculture and different dialects, but generally similar, but not altogether harmonious. So the Diganuida, a near mythic figure who arrived in the area north of, came in on the south shore of Lake Ontario from the north in a stone canoe. So we knew he was different. And he had this message of through peace will come power, and from that you will develop a strong society. So a lot of this happened. Previous diagram flourished under this new era of peace and cooperation. Now, Six Nations is unique in some ways, many ways, but it's the only, one of the few reserves in Canada. There you go, we're calling it a reserve. I'm supposed to call it a territory. But it's still a reserve if it's under the Indian Act. This is an earlier version of the Seneca Longhouse that is in recorded history. and that where people would celebrate those ceremonies. This is a picture of the Mohawk Chapel in Brantford, which was built in 1785. The oldest Protestant church in Upper Canada, built it has never moved. It's on the site within the city limits of Brantford, but that's where the Mohawks settled after we had to escape from upstate New York during the American Revolution. And that's where things began to go bad. In the days leading up to the American Revolution, since we don't have recorded history, I have to rely on the history writings of others, and particularly the French and English explorers. Here, there, in this particular book I have, that we've had some very interesting anthropologists write about Six Nations over the years: Morgan, Parker, Fenton, Shimoni, and lately Weaver. Because of the complexity and interest of our governance system and this developed under this great law, it's with 50 chiefs and clan mothers and so on. It's and all the ceremonials that go with it. It's been a challenge for many people to, and a model for other governance structures. But in 1605, Champlain was making his way up what became the river, and he noticed that they till and cultivate the soil. Planting 3 or 4, they have, you saw the Indian corn, which they raise in gardens, planting 3 or 4 kernels in one place, heap up with a quantity of earth with shells. And then 3 feet apart, they plant more. They sow many squashes and pumpkins, which they likewise cultivate. The Indian corn, which we saw at the time, was about 2 feet high and some as high as 3. That doesn't sound like much, but later in 1779, it was recorded that by another Major John Burroughs, during an event, which I'll explain in a minute, we saw corn, the land exceeds anything I've ever seen. Some corn stalks measured, I don't know, he might have been a very short man. Some corn stalks measured 18 feet. And one cob, 1.5 feet long. Now that's not that far out, because Tuscarora corn is a white corn, hard flint corn, which is one of our open pollinated varieties, and it typically makes the cob that long or more. Not as many rows around. So what happened was, because of this confederacy, 2 things happened. One was we were attractive to the English in their quest to dominate and move west against the French. The French were in the north of the lakes, and we were on the south. So they befriended us, and we accepted them. We still call ourselves allies. We're not subjects like you guys, we're allies. And they built us a Mohawk Chapel because we were allies. We got almost virtually wiped out. During the American Revolution, George Washington sent Generals Clinton and Sullivan and destroyed, I won't read it here, but this one reference is 1 million bushels of corn. The idea was, this was a slash and burn thing. This was the scorched earth policy. It was easier to starve us out than to kill us. So that kind of destroyed our agricultural base. Over time, we had to flee. We went to on the north side of the lake, to Montreal, to Deseronto, to Canandaigua, and eventually Joseph Brant, who was the captain in the British Army by this point, and negotiated with Haldeman for this tract of land 6 miles wide on the other side of the Grand River from mouth to source, and that's what to be our new home. And so the Mohawk Chapel was built a year later to get us settled, because the Mohawks were mostly Christian. The other nations weren't as much Christian, they were still traditional, so they built long houses up and down the river below us. And so now we had to start over. And it was a struggle. The area that over time, there's a long whole history of, there's books I could talk about showing what happened with the land negotiations. This is in spite of this document. It's a wampum belt, commonly known as, in beads, originally struck with the Dutch when they inhabited Manhattan. It says, the European nation is one nation, one line, and we're the other line, and we'll live side by side in peace and not cross each other's path. And we still holler that out from time to time, but it didn't always work that way. So we were now settled into this area. As time went by, the better land got taken by settlers and squatters. Once the settler cut the trees down and planted oats, the government said, well, he's improved the land, so we have to give it to him. And we lost it. So we're now on this 45,000 acres of hard clay, which is what I'm trying to find. Going back to my, so now we're up into, we're getting into 1800s. Joseph Brant himself was encouraging people to adopt what was then modern agriculture, because hunting existence, hunting and gathering wasn't going to be practical in a more confined area. We had hunted in this area before, even though we lived south, we hunted up here. I had treaties struck later on for that, and that's why we have shares in windmill companies that are in this side of the river, because we have the Nanfan Treaty. There's also a treaty that says I can cross the border without paying, but try and do that on a Saturday afternoon, right? So once a year, and in July, a group of people go down to Niagara Falls and cross the Rainbow Bridge and refuse to pay. And it's called the border crossing ceremony. And it's a big it ends up being a big picnic. Nothing that Trump can do about it. So we're getting into the 1800s. Now the Haudenosaunee Council of Chiefs is still governing. So the government's trying to get us to farm, and so there's seed. So people are learning. In fact, some did quite well in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Farming with horses, growing grain crops and hay and a few cattle and so on. So it became a small community of small mixed farms. My grandfather made a living building barns. He'd be a construction guy now, but the old great big beams, and there were no cranes. You had to use horses and gin poles and all those kind of things. So there was enough activity for that. We even had a seed plant. And the very first fall fair, one of the first in Ontario, 1867, was on Six Nations. And one of the band council chiefs' farms. He had nice barns, and first fall fair, 1867. The brick building that the council house originally was, it's too small now for administration, but it was built in 1863. So, we're chugging along here with small mixed farms. Those that weren't farming were probably walking to Brantford to work in factories. We never had hydro until the 1950. I remember back then, Ontario Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario had these beautiful red trucks with gold crests on them and stuff. Coming down the road, we're getting hydro. Some people said we'd all go blind. So, well, you go to Caledonia and shop and they have hydro, you don't go blind. Why would we go blind? My introduction to farming, I guess, began very early. Not only did I get involved with longhouse stuff, because I go back to the very beginning. The reason I was dancing was because my mother taught school. My father hadn't come home from the Air Force yet. The war wasn't over. That's how old I am. So there's a little school, an apartment, so we lived there. And it was at the corner of Six Nations, which was predominantly traditional people. So at certain times of the year, nobody came to school. We'd be two kids, the two Baptists came to school. So my mother would say, well, we're closing up. We'd go to Longhouse. And we were honored guests. We'd be part of that ceremony. I learned to dance because all my friends were out there doing the ceremonial thing. So that's kind of part and parcel of our lifestyle. Is we live together in relative peace most of the time. By 1960, as capital intensive farming emerged and so on, there's only one Native person I know in Canada got a milk quota. People stopped farming because they had no access to credit. Under the Indian Act, you can't, because it's Crown land, you can't use it as collateral. And so commercial banks won't touch you. And those that continued farming usually went to work in a factory like Massey and Cockshut. They were big in Stelco. And then they'd farm at night with the money that their wives said they shouldn't spend. And they'd have cattle and so on, and grow some oats and so on. So that continued. My grandmother was my big inspiration. She was one of the best farmers I knew. She taught crop rotation when I was 5 years old. Now we're still talking about it. She raised chickens and had cattle and used to sell live chickens on the market. Well, she's the one that said there's no future in farming, go and be an engineer. Anyway, I was too interested in machines and farm machines. It seemed like maybe I could do both. So what happened though is that a lot of our land was rented out, and this is another cautionary tale because it's rented out to off-reserve farmers. So they come in from Norfolk County and stuff like that, parts of Brant County. It was cheap land. I remember seeing tractors buried to their axles in the middle of May, because these guys would come in from sand country and they'd try to work the ground and it didn't work. So the land was degraded. So now the reality today is that we're trying to work with this degraded land for field crops. Nobody has animals. There's a few beef farmers. This is I'll do it quickly here. I dug up the lawn. So this is what it would look like if we hadn't done any tillage or any. At the time, we were infested with quackgrass in my early days, and even when I started in the late 70s. And the old accepted practice was summer fallow. Well, that just destroys all organic matter and it all blows away. You can see in the little yellow part, this is the beginning of the clay layer. And I was going to bring it. I have a piece of pottery. This is a very good pottery clay. I've been getting better yields lately by more trash on top. I do cover crops when I can. I farm alone, so mechanization is a big thing with me. This is deep ripping with a no-till point. So this clay soil is very prone to compaction, no matter what you do, and some of it has never been touched. So I've been systematically the last 3 years going through, and I'm getting higher yields. I mean, I used to get 20 bushel soybeans when I started, and I was the first guy to plant soybeans. Took a course here at Guelph. Now I'm getting 45. So I think it's starting to work. I don't plow that anymore. I don't turn it up with a disc. I might just turbo till it in the spring, and I can put corn into that if I want. Lots of clover. Best laid plans of mice and men. This is what happens when you guys up here in Arthur pour all that water on into the Grand River. And that's my corn crop along the river in the end of June. There's corn under there. Hopefully I go and I'll cut it this week. This part here is there's a flood control dike around the bottom of Brantford to keep the water out of the city, and now you know why it's there. And by August, this is what it looked like. You can see stuff that's dead over here, but it actually grew, and this is where we're wide dropping. This is a strange nut. I had 3 CCAs look at this, and no one can explain why that happened. Whatever was in the water burnt the leaves. And we think maybe it was down in the whirl where the sludge, God knows what sludge came down the river, and that burnt the leaves. We got a fresh new layer of mud and no weeds. That's just taken a few days ago. Where it didn't grow, you got that. Soybeans are doing better now. That's actually organic. That's another long story if you want a question about that. I've tried all kinds of alternative crops to try and promote through the agri group that I started different economic ventures. This is not really organic. You just never got sprayed. But it yielded over 40 bushels. That's just my house. Now I got to get back to work. But before I do that, a couple of things. This is the challenge I wanted to leave with you today. Is that this I don't know. It's time for me to pass the torch. But this is a map of the First Nations territories in the province of Ontario. Very hard to read, but you can get bigger copies of it. All those little spots there, those are where people live. So, how do you feed them? You know, with $12 bread and $8 milk, you know, I mean, this isn't it. They still have to do traditional hunting, gathering to survive, right? To a large extent. It's not that people don't want to move. People sometimes want to live there. I was listening to something on the CBC with Cheryle, Manitoba, where people live willingly, and they're paying they have these challenges over the cost of food. This is another slice. The different colors show that those various territories are united into different treaty collectives, which all of which shows that dealing with First Nations policy is very, very difficult. That's why the federal government never really got it. One size does not fit all. And that's something you will learn as you go forward, and engaging people and finding out what they want is what you need to do, not what you think they want. A few quick slides. It's just a roadside set of weeds. It's another economic opportunity. I had a couple of people come by. They're cutting them for bouquets. I had a guy from Hamilton spent a whole weekend cutting along the railway tracks, not this shot, putting in little bundles, and he's going to sell them on the market, you know, like people want them for decoration. So I guess there's an option. Another exciting venture, we're going to hear about our sustenance, so I didn't do their slide, which is a gardening initiative primarily, which you'll hear about. This one is more about forestry and landscape planting. It's called Guyana See, and they start Carolinian forest species in those greenhouses, and they do contract planting. And this is a set of favorite slides. The Indian Agriculture Program of Ontario, now there's a name, but it was started before we had to start changing our names. back in '87. So it is a little bank. Because we can't deal with commercial banks, we have to have, this is why I'm involved with economic development, because we have these incorporated indigenous banks for Aboriginal financial institutions across Canada. I'm on one that does everything but agriculture, because I didn't want the conflict. So we do hairdressers and construction and bid bonds and stuff. And the IAPO does agricultural lending. And they have a youth program, agricultural leadership program. 2 years ago, one of the teams went out and investigated what could be done to have opportunities for indigenous youth to enter agriculture. And so here's some of the results. Fish farming, Manitoulin. Most of these are from Manitoulin Island. Raising animals. This one's actually on Six Nations. Maple syrup, I think that is, and strawberries. That's some hay, and here's all the old guys shipping cattle. So that's kind of my story. So what I can say, the challenge is to how do we? It's like everything else. How do you get people interested in rediscovering their roots? How do you match people's desires with people's wants? Agriculture, as we all know, and you're in this room, is a tremendously interesting and exciting career. Not only at the production level, but certainly at the value-added level. It's difficult to get things started. I've tried processing soybeans, and we had the Soy 2020 make pancakes here one year. Looked at alternative crops. Land base is a big challenge, and financing is a big challenge, and education and awareness is a huge challenge. So I appreciate you listening to the story. It's been fun for me to try and present it, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try and deal with them. Thank you.